This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. So, in light of the passing of Jane Goodall this week, we wanted to devote some time to discussing her work with chimpanzees, her conservation work, and her as a person.
Jane Goodall, sad day that we've lost her. One of the greatest primatologists of our time, one of the greatest animal behaviorists, one of the greatest scientists of our time, one of the best known, most admired, most beloved human on earth. She was extraordinary. Let me try to give you a sense of this. The work that she did with chimpanzees, utterly pioneering. The conservation work that she did, an extraordinary person. Okay, broad outline, just sort of her biography. She was born in 1934, so she died at age 91, middle class British family, famously was given a little stuffed chimpanzee as a child, which she adored. She was obsessed with animals. She was described as rather eccentric, rather ethereal. Grew up, finished high school, found work as a secretary, was bored out of her mind, and got a letter from a friend who had moved to Kenya, inviting her to come for a visit. Kenya, East Africa, animals. She quit her job, picked up, went over to Kenya, and was in the most amazing place on earth. And what she very quickly did was track down Louis Leakey. Louis Leakey, the man paleontologist who first showed that humans first emerged in East Africa, phenomenally influential. He was just before the height of his fame at that point. Louis Leakey digging in Old Divide Gorge in northern Tanzania for human remains. And she came to visit him because she wanted to talk about animals and evolution and behavior and humans' place in the animal world. And he came away very impressed with her and offered her a job as a secretary. So she moved into his camp in northern Tanzania and became a secretary. And gradually he sprung on her the plan that he had all along. Leakey had an insight, which was, of course, in this era, every primatologist on Earth was male. He decided that females would be better primatologists. They would be more patient. They would be quieter. They would be less threatening to their study subjects. And he had decided he wanted to start exploring this. And before it was over, Leakey had fostered, mentored the careers of three women who he called his trimates, which lots of other people called Leakey's angels. Three women, Jane Goodall first, going off to study chimpanzees, Dian Fossey, going off to study gorillas, and Baruti Galdikas, going off to study orangutans. He set her up in 1957 to start studying about chimps, studying about primate behavior, and in 1960 placed her in a reserve in Tanzania called Gombe, right on the edge of Lake Tanganyika. She started there and proceeded to be the most tenacious, most observant primatologist of all time, seeing amazing things about chimp behavior, chimp society. Soon she became world famous. National Geographic fell in love with her, had her on the cover of various issues, had a bunch of specials about her. And part of it was her science was turning out to be amazing. Part of it was, oh my God, straight out of Hollywood casting. Here's this wispy, blonde, timid English woman living alone in the jungles of Africa with nothing but chimpanzees. This was utterly irresistible. She became world famous in the process. By the mid 1970s, she was having the same problem that almost all field primatologists do, which is realizing your species is not going to last for long unless something is done to try to save them from extinction. The threat of extinction to a majority of primate species out in the wild, and Gombe's chimps, Goodall's chimps, were no different. And she made the transition that about half of primatologists do mid-career, which is forget watching my animals. I'm going to become a conservationist to try to save my animals. And eventually a conservationist in the broadest sense of wildlife. Now, westernized white people who study animals in the developing world and suddenly become ennobled conservationists often have a certain smell about them of neocolonialism. And a Kenyan friend of mine sort of stated it great once, which is, oh, great. You people, you Americans, for example, who got this incredible economy and industrial revolution amid, among other things, completely wiping out the buffalo migratory herds in your country so you could feed half the nation with your breadbasket there. Suddenly, you show up and tell us we can't do the same thing with the migratory wildebeest herds because they are so wonderful and valuable. And oh, we are so much more enlightened, we in the West, when you've already destroyed your wildlife and done nothing but profit from it. Now you show up and try to tell us the same thing. So there's always been that danger of a sort of neocolonialist flavor to, ooh, we want to save the animals, independent of the people living around them, independent of the people heavily impacted by wildlife in the developing world. Goodall was one of the pioneers avoiding this. She first worked locally. She did all sorts of reforestation programs with the people living around Gombe. She generated scholarships for some of the girls there. Eventually, she started a program she called Roots and Shoots, which was to get kids in the developing world to learn about the wildlife around them and to realize their value and their beauty and their inspiration, all of that. Roots and Shoots now has clubs in more than 100 countries on Earth. So she was doing this whole conservationist route. She eventually turned into this worldwide icon. She traveled 300 days a year, being willing to go anywhere, talk anywhere in the name of animal conservation, was on the committees of every wildlife conservation fund. She gave delightful public lectures in which she showed off her ability to hoot like a chimp. And she always had a little stuffy chimp with her, not the one that she had as a child, but raising money for conservation up until last week, where at the age of 91, she was doing yet another one of those gigs, in this case in Los Angeles, and died that night. All right, so what about her science? What about the chimpanzee work that dominated her first 15, 20 years or so? She was extraordinary. Showed up there and put an enormous effort into having to habituate the chimps living there in the rainforest, getting them accustomed to her presence. And she did it by being silent and moving slowly and unobtrusive, but never invisible. And slowly she kind of became part chimp to them, part strange primate, part fly on the wall. And in the process, she discovered amazing things about chimps that no one had ever done that detailed of studies of chimp behavior. And ultimately, she and her students and Tanzanian descendant researchers have now been monitoring those chimps for 65 years. What were some of the things she found? Chimps had incredibly strong personalities, individualistic ones. They had complex family relations. They had complex social politics, particularly so that a couple of decades later, Frans de Waal, whose work we've talked about, wrote a best-selling book called Chimpanzee Politics, analyzing chimpanzee Machiavellian competition. Goodall was seeing the first evidence of this. Then she found something that flabbergasted everyone, which was chimps were not just hunters, they were cooperative hunters. They worked in a very synchronized, organized way to trap bush buck, to trap monkeys, that they would get them, they would kill them, and even more remarkable was they would then share the meat among themselves, and not just a function of who were the hunters, but to everybody in the group. So that amazed people. Then Goodall changed the definition of human and changed the definition of chimpanzee. One day, she went out and observing one of her chimps, saw something which I still get the chills with envy thinking about what must have that moment been like for her, realizing what she was seeing, a chimp using a tool, a chimp who had stripped a bit of twig until it was a very small twig thing and inserting it into a termite mound. The termites in there promptly biting onto this thing, invading their colony, and then the chimp would pull it out and eat off the termites. Tool use. No one had ever suspected that chimps, that any other species out there would make tools. Humans, the definition was we were not only the tool makers, we were the only tool makers. Flabbergasting. And Leakey, when he heard this, famously said, okay, at this point, we're either going to have to change the definition of tool, the definition of human, or the definition of chimp. And this changed our whole perspective. We are not the only tool makers. And Goodall eventually showing chimps made a whole variety of tools. And eventually, chimp researchers all across Africa documenting different types of tools in different regions, 27 different chimp populations found to be making tools, using them in different ways from one place to another, showing the spread of chimp tool culture going around there. Eventually, paleontological sites found where chimps back when had been making tools. Absolutely extraordinary insights into how kids would learn from mom how to make tools. One great detail on that, and this was the work of Ann Pusey, Duke University, showing chimp daughters were really good at learning how to make tools by watching mom. Chimp sons were lousy at it because they couldn't focus and just were screwing around and wrestling somebody else. Daughters were acquiring the tool making skills much more readily. Since then, two critical things that chimps have not shown, which is active instruction in tool making. Mom leaning over and taking daughter's hands and shaping them to make the tool. It's purely observational. The other thing that has not been seen with chimp tool making is accretion of knowledge, accretion of sophistication. The chimps 50,000 years ago, by the best evidence, were making the same tools they're making now, not building upon it. Okay, so tool use, totally amazing. And that ushered in Goodall's sort of dark phase of seeing some disturbing things as well about chimp behavior. She observed infanticide. We've talked about this before as a strategy, a competitive reproductive strategy. Kill the offspring of some competitor who wants to pass on copies of their genes, and you set them back by doing so, and you then advance your own reproductive fortunes. And that what was striking was observing females killing each other's kids, usually high-ranking females doing that to low-ranking ones, seeing cannibalism afterward of the kids who were killed. Most strikingly, Goodall, once again, changing all of our notions of human exceptionalism. We are not the only species that kills members of our own species. We are not the only species that has organized group violence. And what she famously observed was the Gombe War, a 2-year period where all the males from one of the groups, and reasonably enough, given what we've covered previously about sociobiology, chimp migration patterns are such that most of the males in a group are brothers, cousins, have known each other their whole lives because they stick around. So highly cooperative groups of males would patrol the border of their territory. And if they found a male chimp from the other group over, they would attack him and savage him and kill him. And over the course of the 2 years, all the males in this one group systematically killed all the males in this neighboring group, expanded their territory. By some version of how we think of what constitutes genocide, this was genocide, killing every individual of some demographic subgroup within a population, killing those individuals not because of who they were individually, but simply because of the category they belonged to. And this was earth shattering. So, this is a broad picture of what came out of her first couple of decades of work and since then carried on by her students, colleagues. Not surprisingly, some of her work was heavily criticized. Some of it was just basically snotty and childish criticisms. Some of it was, oh my God, she gave her animals names. Back at that time, if you were a serious scientist, the last thing on earth that you would ever do is give your study subjects names. They would get numbers. Goodall gave them names, and Goodall reveled in their personalities and idiosyncrasies and individualities. And it was the centerpiece of the science that she was reporting, which was charming to most of the world, but was just anathema to hard-ass, serious scientists. We give our animals numbers, and we don't talk about things like their emotions, their strategies, what they were thinking. Decades later, cognitive ethology would be getting to that. What she also did eventually was interact with her study subjects, another cardinal sin of field primatology, where if they came up, they wanted like touch her hand, touch her hair, pull at her clothing a bit. She was okay with that. You're not supposed to do that. So she did all those things that were unprofessional. Then further snarkiness. She was not a very scientific primatologist. She did not have a whole lot of formal training. As I noted before, she didn't go to college. At one point, a few years into her becoming world famous, Leakey said, okay, I'm going to talk to my buddies at Cambridge in the UK, and they're going to admit her into their ethology doctoral program, where she was mentored by a guy named Robert Hines, famed ethologist. And essentially, her work there consisted of writing up her field notes into some publications. And she came out the other end, Dr. Jane Goodall, PhD, but most of the field still perceived her as a little bit of a wait. This was Leakey's secretary, and now dear sweet Jane with her chimps is out there becoming world famous. There was some jealousy about this. There was some snarkiness about this. Nonetheless, she was not a very quantitative scientist. She was not terribly rigorous in her methods. She was mostly describing observational stuff. So snarkiness about that, but amid that snarkiness, only someone who would have stuck it out for as long as she did had this tenacity, had this temperament, had this observational patience to see stuff like discover tool use and chimpanzee wars and cooperative hunting. She was totally amazing, but she was not a hard-ass generating numbers and statistics and analytical approaches to understanding her species. It was much more descriptive. The biggest criticism, though, was a very, very valid one in terms of her techniques. Early on, in order to get close to her subjects, to habituate them, she did something which is the sin of all sins among field primatologists, which is she provisioned the chimps. She fed them. She gave them food out of her camp. So they would come there and grew comfortable with that environment and grew comfortable with her, and she provisioned them in order to be able to habituate them. Why is this totally sinful thing to do? Because that generates aggression, because your subjects start competing over the food and fighting over it. And there was a lot of perception in the field that the chimp war had in fact been triggered by her provisioning them. Eventually, she stopped doing this, and at the time that she first did this, there was not enough field primatology for this to be one of the original sins. This was her doing what she needed to do, but eventually she sort of recognized that was disruptive. And forever after, there was the critique that the aggression that she saw was not natural. It was an outcome of human presence, human interference, human feeding of them. And what has been shown in the years since, a major paper in Nature in 2014 from 18 other chimpanzee sites showing equivalents of the Gombe War occurring in their sites, regardless of whether or not there were humans living nearby, regardless of whether or not there had been provisioning, it seemed to have had nothing to do with it. It was for real. But that was probably the strongest criticism of her work. Okay, Goodall as a person. Interestingly, she had prosopagnosia, which is this neuropsychological disorder where you have trouble recognizing faces, human faces, but she was perfectly great recognizing her chimps. At one point, about 10 years ago, she had a book that was about to come out, something on conservation, which at the last moment the publisher pulled it because it turned out large stretches of the book were plagiarized. And Goodall came up with a classic thing there, which was, oh, I just got sloppy with my referencing or with my quotation marks. The book was pulled, completely rewritten, eventually published. The field was kind of ambivalent as to what to make of the fact that that had occurred with one of her many books. The biggest, most disturbing historical sort of scar on Goodall's legacy came in 1975. And that was around the point where her chimp studies had taken off and there were a billion different questions to pursue, and she was world famous, and deciding she wanted to expand her operation to begin to have students there, student volunteers, graduate students coming there for years on end to study the population, just so much to go and study. And she formed a very collaborative relationship with my Stanford University. And a large chimp enclosure was built in the hills above Stanford, where there was going to be a chimp population there, which was called Gombe West. And the plan was for Goodall to spend about 6 months a year out in the field, 6 months a year at Stanford, studying the chimps there, teaching. This was all set to go. It was going to be spectacular. The first waves of Stanford students went off there. And in 1975, there was a disaster. About 30 miles across the lake, Lake Tanganyika, was a guerrilla G-U-E-R, a guerrilla group of rebels who were bent on overthrowing Mobutu, who was the dictator of the Congo at the time, one of the all-time kleptocrats of history. And this was a violent guerrilla group that was beginning to start an uprising in the eastern Congo, and got word this famous lady scientist and a whole bunch of white students were over there and decided to attack the camp at night and kidnapped a bunch of them, 4 of Goodall's students. There were 30 people in the camp at the time. Some of the Tanzanian guards were beaten badly by these guerrillas who attacked. Goodall escaped. Everybody else escaped except for these 4 students who were tied up and driven across the lake and kept in captivity there. And this was a massive crisis. Eventually, it was figured out that the guerrilla leader of this group, a man named Laurent Kabila, figured out it was a good idea to ransom them. Interestingly, historically, eventually Kabila's forces did overthrow Mobutu in Kinshasa some years later, and Kabila became the president of Zaire. And at that point, everybody in the primate community, including these 4 kidnapped students who were eventually released, kind of went to the State Department just when the U.S. was forging a great cooperative alliance with Kabila, who was making all the right anti-communist sounds and saying, this guy was actually a terrorist kidnapper back when. And they got nowhere with the State Department. And Kabila was a trusted partner with American foreign interests until he was assassinated. His son took over, who was eventually overthrown, and I saw recently was condemned to death in absentia by the new government there, renamed Democratic Republic of the Congo. But these 4 students had now been kidnapped. And Kabila and his group let it known they wanted approximately $500,000 to send these students back. And obviously, Goodall didn't have the money to do this. And these were Stanford students. And eventually, money was raised among Stanford alum, among the parents of some of these students. And the head of Gombe West, the Stanford scientist named David Hamburg, who I admire enormously, was a mentor of mine. Hamburg very dangerously filled up his knapsack with dollar bills or something and went off into eastern Zaire and ransomed the students. Where was the problem with Goodall in this? She was, above all else, terrified that paying any ransom money for the students would make her research site a target. She stopped taking foreign students at that point, solely Tanzanian field assistants. But she was so intent on making sure nothing was done that would endanger her field site that she fairly actively interfered with the negotiations to try to get the students back. And in the aftermath of the negotiations being successful, Stanford severed her ties with them, and Gombe West facility has been empty and building up cobwebs ever since. And this was about a dozen years before I got to Stanford, but I know a lot of the principals in this whole drama, including one of the people who was kidnapped, and they were left really bitter about what Goodall did. So I see that as an unfortunate sort of shadow in her legacy. I met Goodall only one time after revering her since my childhood. I exchanged letters with her a number of times. She had some questions about hormones at some point. At one point, about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was on a committee in DC, National Institutes of Health, a committee that was going to decide whether or not to ban biomedical research on chimpanzees. And we decided to ban them. And Goodall was one of our advisors, and she zoomed in. Zoom didn't exist yet, but she, whatever it was at the time, in from her home in Tanzania. And we consulted with her, and she gave us advice on strategy as to how best to go about convincing American biomedical establishment that they could live without making use of chimpanzee vivisection. So some interactions with her, but I finally met her about 7, 8 years ago. And I was all set to be kind of bristly, perhaps, and bitter, knowing what had gone down with the kidnapping fiasco, and knowing that all sorts of people who had been greatly troubled, endangered by her, had some pretty bitter feelings. And meeting her was one of the most unsettling experiences I've had in my life. I've never met a person who was as still and as calm. And all you felt being there with her was you felt like you were some sort of bumbling troglodyte, Bigfoot or something. She had this serenity about her that I found instantly evaporated any residual crankiness I had about her. She was extraordinary. She was close to 90 at the time, and a stillness like all primatologists wind up having to be still and patient if they're going to do that out in the field, like nothing I've ever seen. Completely intimidating, some Buddha-like presence there. I came away tremendously rattled and moved by my encounter with her. She was extraordinary. And for anyone who has grown up being amazed by what primates are, the world has been diminished by her passing.
And on that note, that's all for episode 81. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of science and the beard.